Imagine a night so still, so dark, that even the torch flames seemed afraid to flicker. It is 390 BC. The city of Rome, that glorious, marble-veined seat of civilization, sits perched on its 7 hills. And somewhere beyond the Tiber River, an army is coming. An army the Romans have already met. An army the Romans have already lost to. The Gauls are coming for the city. And the last line of defense between Rome's smoldering ruins and whatever dignity she has left is a handful of soldiers stationed on the Capitoline Hill, the most sacred, most fortified ground in all of the Republic. They should be safe. They are on high ground. They have walls. They have weapons. But they also have something else. Something no one thought to account for. They have sleep. What happened that night would haunt Roman culture for generations, and the mistake those soldiers made would be etched into history not as a tragedy, but as a warning. Welcome. Tonight, we go back to one of the most dramatic, improbable, and utterly human moments in all of ancient history. A moment where the fate of an empire that would one day stretch from Britain to Babylon, hung not on swords or siege engines, but on the sound of silence. And the men who failed to listen to it. This is the story of the siege of Rome, of the senones, of the Capitoline Hill, and of the fatal mistake the Roman sentinels made on the darkest night of the Republic's early life. Stay with me, because this story is stranger and more human than you might expect. The world before the fall. Who were the Gauls? Let's go back further. Before the night climb, before the sleeping guards, before the geese. We need to understand who the Gauls were and why Rome, the rising star of Italy, was so catastrophically unprepared for them. The year is around the early 4th century BC. Rome is not yet the Rome of gladiators, emperors, and Colosseum spectacles. This is early Rome, Republican Rome, a city of perhaps 100,000 souls, governed by 2 annually elected consuls, defended by citizen soldiers, and held together by a fierce, almost obsessive civic pride. Rome had been expanding steadily through the Italian peninsula for decades, defeating the Latins, subduing the Etruscans, slowly, methodically, planting its roots deeper into the soil of central Italy. The Romans of this era were tough, disciplined, and confident, perhaps, as it would turn out, a little too confident. Now, to the north of Italy, beyond the Po River, lay a world Rome barely understood and frankly barely cared about. The Celtic peoples, whom the Romans called Galli, the Gauls, inhabited these lands. They were organized into tribes, each with their own chiefs, their own customs, their own warrior culture that prized individual heroism, ferocity in battle, and the accumulation of cattle and gold above almost everything else. The Gauls were not barbarians in the modern sense of the word, that loaded, dismissive term we sometimes apply carelessly to ancient peoples. They were sophisticated, traded widely, produced stunning metalwork, and maintained complex social hierarchies. But they were very different from the Romans. Where Rome prized order and formation, the Gauls prized the charge. Where Romans built systems, Gauls built reputation. Where Romans planned for decades, Gauls often lived for the moment. And in 390 BC, or thereabouts, historians debate the exact date. One particular tribe of Gauls, the Senones, was on the move. The Senones had come south. According to the ancient historian Livy, our most detailed, if sometimes embellished, source for these events, they had been hired as mercenaries by the Etruscans, who were perpetually at odds with Rome. But something more fundamental was happening too. The Senones wanted land. They wanted resources. And like so many peoples throughout history, they followed their ambitions south. What they found along the way would change everything. They arrived near a small town called Clusium, in Etruria. Clusium was not Roman, it was Etruscan, but in desperation, the Clusians appealed to Rome for help. The Senate sent ambassadors. 3 men from the prestigious Fabii family, tasked with negotiating, mediating, perhaps convincing the Senones to take their ambitions elsewhere. It did not go well. In a breakdown of diplomacy that reads almost like farce if the consequences weren't so devastating, the Fabii ambassadors ended up joining the Clusians in battle against the Gauls, a spectacular violation of the sacred rules of ambassadorial conduct. One of the Fabii reportedly killed a Gallic chieftain in the fighting. The senones, furious, demanded that Rome hand over the offending ambassadors for punishment. Rome refused. In fact, Rome did worse than refuse. The Roman people, in a stunning display of either supreme confidence or supreme arrogance, elected the very same Fabii as military tribunes for the following year, essentially telling the Gauls, "These are now our military commanders. What exactly do you intend to do about it?" The Gauls had an answer ready. They turned south, away from Clusium, away from the Etruscans, toward Rome. An army was coming, and Rome was not ready. The river of disaster, the Battle of Allia. The senones moved fast. Ancient sources describe their march as almost alarming in its speed and decisiveness, a quality Celtic warriors were famous for. They didn't lay siege to towns. They didn't pause to pillage. They came directly for Rome. Word reached the city. There was panic. There was debate. There was the hurried gathering of legions, citizen soldiers pulled from their farms and workshops and given their shields and gladii and told, essentially, to go defend civilization. The Romans marched out to meet them at the river Allia, a small tributary of the Tiber, about 11 miles north of Rome. The date, approximately July 18, 390 BC, would become one of the most infamous in the Roman calendar. The Romans called it the Dies Alliensis, the Black Day. For centuries afterward, Romans refused to conduct any important business, sign contracts, or begin military campaigns on this date. It was cursed, and you'll understand why. The numbers are disputed. Ancient sources always inflate armies to dramatic proportions, but the Roman force numbered somewhere between 15,000 and 40,000 men, depending on which account you trust. The Gauls were probably comparable in size, though the Romans seemed to think they were outnumbered. The battle, if we can even call it that, was a catastrophe. The Romans deployed with their flanks extended on the hills, their center weaker than it should have been. There was confusion in the command structure. These were military tribunes, not consuls, leading the force, and coordination seems to have failed at every level. The Gallic warriors, with their wild charging style and terrifying war cries, slammed into the Roman lines. The Romans broke. Not bent, not staggered, broke. The right wing collapsed first, then the rest followed in something close to a rout. Men threw down their shields and ran. Some fled north to Veii, a nearby Etruscan city. Some made it back toward Rome. Many simply didn't make it anywhere at all. The Tiber, according to Livy, ran red. Livy writes with barely concealed horror, there was no attempt to rally, no stand made anywhere. The Romans fled in disarray, without having once faced the enemy. It was one of the most complete military disasters in Roman history. And the road to Rome was now wide open. Here is where the story takes a turn that would echo through Roman mythology for the next 8 centuries. Word of the disaster reached Rome before the survivors did. The city erupted. People knew, with a terrible certainty, what was coming. What did Rome do? Some fled. Many of the civilians, particularly women, children, and the elderly, were evacuated, sent to nearby towns, to the countryside, to anywhere that wasn't in the path of the oncoming army. The Vestal Virgins, the sacred priestesses who tended Rome's eternal flame, famously loaded the sacred relics of Rome onto a cart and carried them away on foot to Caira, a friendly Etruscan city. There is something heartbreaking and magnificent about that image. These women in their white robes, carrying the symbols of Roman religion through the dust of a summer afternoon, not knowing if there would ever be a Rome to bring them back to. But not everyone left. Some Romans, the old men, the former magistrates, those too proud or too feeble to run, made a different choice. They put on their finest togas. They sat in their ivory chairs in the forum and in their homes. If Rome was to be sacked, they would meet their fate with dignity. According to Livy, the Gauls entering Rome were so stunned by the sight of these motionless, ancient figures, sitting in perfect silence like statues, that some initially believed they were gods. Until one Gaul reached out and stroked the long white beard of a senator named Marcus Papirius. Papirius struck the Gaul with his ivory staff. It was the last thing he ever did. The spell broke. The Gauls understood what they were looking at. The massacre began. Rome burned. For 7 months, some sources say, though the timeline is disputed, the Gauls occupied the city. They looted. They destroyed. The smell of smoke would have carried for miles. The great public buildings, the temples, the wooden structures that made up most of Rome's less prestigious neighborhoods, much of it went to ash. But there was one place the Gauls had not yet taken. One hill. One fortress. One last symbol of Roman defiance. The Capitoline. The sacred hill, Rome's last stand. The Capitoline Hill was the spiritual heart of Rome. It was home to the temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus. Jupiter the best and greatest, the supreme deity of the Roman pantheon. It housed the sacred geese of Juno. It was where triumphs ended and where desperate men prayed. And it was where a group of Roman soldiers, senators, and civilians had retreated after the Battle of the Allia. They had supplies. They had walls. They had the high ground. The Capitoline was steep on most sides, almost cliff-like, a natural fortress enhanced by Roman engineering. The Gauls tried a frontal assault. They were repelled. The slopes were too steep, the defenders too determined. So the Gauls did what any sensible army does when they can't take something by force. They settled in for a siege. Think about what that means for the people on that hill. You are watching your city burn from above. The smoke rises in great black columns. You can occasionally hear the sounds drifting up, or perhaps nothing at all, which is in some ways worse. You know that below you, everything you have ever known is being picked apart. Your homes, your temples, your civic life, the streets where you walked with your children, and you sit on a hill and wait. Days turn to weeks. Weeks may have turned to months. Food became scarce. The Romans reportedly began rationing so severely that they threw what bread they could spare over the walls to taunt the Gauls below, to show they weren't yet desperate enough to surrender. Whether this is true or propaganda or legend, it became part of the Roman story. The Romans of the Capitoline were stubborn. They would not yield. The Gauls, for their part, were growing frustrated. They had burned the city. They had plundered extensively. But they hadn't decisively conquered Rome, not while those soldiers held the hill. And their own supplies were beginning to strain. Disease was creeping through their encampment, as it always did when armies sat still in summer heat. Something had to give, and the Gauls were determined it would be the Romans. Then came the discovery that changed everything. One of the Gallic scouts, or perhaps a spy or a deserter, noticed something. On the southwestern face of the Capitoline, where the cliff was steepest and the defenses presumably lightest, there were marks in the rock. Marks in the dust. The signs of someone who had recently climbed there. It turned out that a young Roman messenger had found a way up and down the cliff in the darkness, seeking to slip messages to reinforcements gathering outside the city. He was using a path, if you can call it that, along the steepest, most treacherous face of the hill. The Romans thought it was too dangerous for an enemy to use. The Gauls thought otherwise. And so, on a night shrouded in darkness, a team of Gallic warriors began their ascent. The silent ascent. The night the guards slept. Picture this. It is the deep of night. The kind of darkness that feels almost solid. No electric light, no reflected glow from a city that is largely ash. The stars are out, but the moon is either absent or obscured. Below, the Gallic camp flickers with cook fires. Above, on the Capitoline, the defenders sleep in shifts. Or they are supposed to. At the base of the cliff, a group of Gallic warriors begins to climb. They are good at this. The Celts were a people of mountains and forests, of movement through terrain that others called impassable. These men knew how to move quietly, how to find handholds in rock, how to carry weapons without letting metal scrape against stone. They tested each foothold before committing their weight. They breathed slowly. They did not speak. Hand over hand. Foot over foot. The cliff is steep, genuinely terrifying in daylight, let alone in darkness. But they keep climbing. Their fingers find the grooves where the previous climber's hands had worn the stone. They follow the path. And they reach the top. Not with a crash. Not with a shout. In silence. The Roman sentinels, the men assigned to watch this particular stretch of wall, are asleep. Exhausted from weeks of siege. Worn down by hunger, anxiety, the grinding psychological weight of watching their city burn. Maybe they told themselves the cliff was too steep. Maybe they genuinely believed no enemy would attempt it. Maybe they simply closed their eyes for a moment and that moment stretched into eternity, as moments do when the body is pushed beyond endurance. Whatever the reason, the guards slept. And in that silence, Rome nearly ended. This is the moment that historians argue about. This is the moment that philosophers have pondered. This is the moment that became a Roman morality tale that would be retold for centuries. The guards slept. Their dogs slept. The walls were unguarded. The Gauls crept forward across the sacred summit of the Capitoline hill, past sleeping men, past embers of cook fires, weapons drawn, in absolute silence. And then the geese. Juno's sacred geese. The white geese kept in the precinct of Juno's temple on the Capitoline were sacred animals, wards of the goddess herself. They were, apparently, well-fed even during the siege. Livy notes pointedly that unlike the dogs, which had gone hungry, the geese were maintained at the expense of the diminishing food supply because of their religious significance. And geese, as anyone who has ever encountered them knows, are not quiet creatures. They are territorial, alert, and possessed of a remarkable instinct for detecting intrusion. The geese screamed. A cacophony of honking, flapping, shrieking erupted across the summit of the Capitoline at precisely the moment the Gauls were most vulnerable. Exposed, outnumbered by the potential defenders, their element of surprise their only real advantage. One man woke up first. His name was Marcus Manlius. He was a former consul, a man of considerable military experience, and by all accounts he kept his head in the kind of moment that turns lesser men to stone. He grabbed his weapons and ran toward the commotion. A Gallic warrior had already reached the edge of the wall. Manlius slammed his shield into the man, not a careful, tactical blow, but a raw, desperate heave, and the Gaul tumbled backward, possibly onto other Gauls below. The chaos of the descent in darkness on a steep cliff with an enemy now alert and shouting, it broke the assault. The Gauls fell back. Some literally fell. The Romans swarmed to the walls. The moment of crisis passed. Rome had been saved by geese. Think about that for a moment. The fate of Western civilization, or at least one thread of it, turned on the alertness of a flock of birds and the speed of one man reaching for his shield in the dark. But here is where the story gets human. Really human. The next morning, in the thin dawn light, the Romans assembled on the Capitola, and they dealt with accountability. The commander of the guard convened a tribunal of sorts. The sleeping sentinels, or at least those identified as having been responsible for the watch that night, were brought forward. The punishment for a Roman soldier falling asleep on guard duty was ancient and unambiguous. The offending guards were thrown from the Tarpeian Rock, a sheer cliff on the edge of the very Capitoline hill they had failed to guard. It was the traditional Roman execution for traitors, and that is essentially how these men were categorized. They had been trusted with the defense of Rome's last sacred ground. They had slept, and the price they paid was their lives. Marcus Manlius, the man who had saved the hill, was celebrated, given a new cognomen, called Capitolinus, for his defense of the capital. Showered with gifts from grateful defenders, each man giving from his meager daily ration as a token of honor. It seemed, in the cold logic of Roman judgment, entirely fair. History, however, is rarely that tidy. The aftermath: gold, shame, and the price of survival. The Gauls had failed to take the Capitoline by stealth, but the siege continued, and the Romans on the hill were running out of time. Disease was spreading through the Gallic camp, something that always happened when large armies sat in one place for too long in the ancient world. The Gauls, whose supplies and patience were both wearing thin, became more amenable to negotiation. The Romans, exhausted and starving on their hill, sent an envoy. What followed was a negotiation that became one of the most famous and most shameful moments in early Roman history. Rome agreed to pay the Gauls a ransom, 1,000 pounds of gold in exchange for withdrawal. It was a staggering sum. It was also, frankly, the only real option left. The army gathering outside the city under Camillus, a general who had been recalled from exile to save Rome, was not yet in a position to relieve the hill. The gold was the price of time. Scales were brought out. The gold was being weighed. And then the Gauls produced their own weights, and the Romans noticed they were false. Heavier than they should be. The Gauls were cheating. They were demanding more gold than the agreed amount. A Roman officer protested loudly, and the Gallic king, Brennus, did something that would burn itself into Roman memory forever. He drew his sword. He placed it on the scale with the weights, adding its mass to the demand. Then he said 4 words, or rather, 2 Latin words that history has never forgotten. Vi victis. Woe to the conquered. Woe to the conquered. There is no mercy here. There is no appeal. There is only the sword on the scale and the terrible arithmetic of defeat. What happened next is disputed and probably legendary, but it is so perfectly Roman in its telling that it has survived as truth regardless. Camillus arrived with his army and declared, according to Livy, that Rome was ransomed with iron, not gold. His soldiers drove the Gauls from the city. Whether the story is exactly true is debated by modern historians. The Gauls almost certainly did withdraw, whether by military defeat at Camillus's hands, by disease, by the weight of their losses, or simply because they had taken what they came for and the extended siege no longer served their purposes. The Romans preferred the version where Camillus heroically drove them out. We should not be surprised by this. The Gauls left. Rome was free. But Rome was broken. The city that greeted the returning survivors was not the city they had left. The records were gone. Many of the ancient archives, the genealogical records, the historical documents that formed the backbone of Roman institutional memory, had been destroyed. The physical infrastructure was devastated. The psychological wound was deep. A city had survived, but something had been lost that could never quite be recovered. The long shadow, what Rome learned from its worst night. What does a civilization do after it has seen its worst day? Rome's answer, characteristically, was to rebuild and to remember, and to build the memory of humiliation into something generative. The Gauls became, for Romans, the ultimate nightmare. A cultural terror that lasted for centuries. The phrase Gallica terror, the Gallic fear, entered the Roman vocabulary and stayed there. When Gallic tribes threatened Italy again in the 3rd century BC, the Romans mobilized with a speed and ferocity that surprised even their allies. They had not forgotten. They would not forget. The Senones, the very tribe that had sacked Rome, were eventually hunted to effective extinction by Roman legions. Whether this was strategic calculation or something closer to revenge dressed in the language of strategy is an interesting question. But the night on the Capitoline left other marks too. More subtle ones. Roman military discipline, already severe, was hardened further. The punishment for sleeping on watch, always serious, became even more embedded in Roman military culture as an unforgivable offense. The story of the sleeping sentinels was told and retold not as a historical curiosity but as an active lesson. Generals referenced it. Philosophers discussed it. The idea that one moment of failure, one lapse of attention, one surrender to human weakness, sleep, could cost everything, became a kind of founding myth of Roman military virtue. And then there is Marcus Manlius Capitolinus, the man who saved the hill, the hero of the Capitoline. His story does not end in triumph. In the years following the Gallic sack, Rome faced severe economic hardship. Many citizens had been ruined by the destruction, left with debt they could not repay. A particularly harsh Roman practice effectively allowed creditors to enslave debtors who couldn't pay. The poor were suffering. Manlius, by now a celebrated war hero with wealth and prestige, did something unusual. He began defending the debtors. He used his own money to free men from debt bondage. He advocated loudly for the poor against the patrician creditors. He gathered followers. The Senate watched this with increasing alarm. A popular war hero, distributing wealth, building a following among the poor, positioning himself as their champion against the elite. This was the profile in Rome's political imagination of a tyrant in waiting, a king. And Rome had thrown out its kings. The Republic was founded on the principle that no man would ever rule Rome alone again. Manlius was accused of aiming at tyranny. He was tried, found guilty, and in a dark irony that would be hard to invent, Marcus Manlius Capitolinus, the man who saved the Capitoline, was thrown from the Tarpeian Rock, the same cliff that had been the execution site of the guards who slept on the night he saved everything. His house on the Capitoline was demolished. His name was banned from being used in his family's clan. A law was passed forbidding any patrician from living on the Capitola. Rome scrubbed him from the sacred ground he had once defended with his own body. History is full of men destroyed by the very thing that made them great. The story of the sleeping sentinels, the sacred geese, the night climb, and the sword on the scale. It became one of those cornerstone stories that a culture returns to again and again to define itself. Romans used it to explain their own military culture, their own pride, their own hatred of personal surrender. Polybius, the great Greek historian writing in the 2nd century BC, describes the Roman military punishment system and explicitly connects it to the need for total vigilance. Cicero references the Gallic sack as a wound that never fully healed. Virgil weaves the Capitoline and the geese into the Aeneid, Rome's great founding epic, as images of heroic resistance. For 800 years after the event, Romans were still telling the story. And in a way, we still are. The deeper question, what does this mean? Let me bring this back to the fundamental question, the fatal mistake. We talk about it as a mistake, the sleeping guards, and it was. In purely military terms, it was a catastrophic lapse in discipline at the single most critical moment of Rome's early history. Had the Gauls not been stopped, had Manlius not woken up, had the geese not sounded their alarm, the Capitoline falls. The last Roman resistance collapses. Rome becomes a memory, not an empire. But there's something worth pausing on. These were human beings. Men who had been awake for days, possibly weeks. Men who had watched their city burn. Men who were hungry and frightened and possibly grieving, for friends lost at the Allia, for family members who had not made it to the hill. Men who were perched on a cold stone fortress, surrounded, with no clear prospect of rescue. And they slept. Because they were human. Because the body, under enough strain, simply takes what it needs regardless of the consequences. Rome punished them for it. Rome made their lapse into a legend of failure. And Rome was not wrong to enforce its standards. The stakes were existential. But perhaps the real lesson is not simply, do not sleep on watch. Perhaps the real lesson is about systems. About redundancy. About never relying on human endurance alone. The Romans, in the aftermath of the Gallic sack, began building better walls. They began professionalizing their military more rigorously. They began thinking about the gap between what discipline demands and what human beings can actually sustain. Every great civilization that followed them, and many that didn't follow Rome at all, grappled with the same problem. How do you build institutions that don't depend entirely on individuals never failing? Because individuals always fail sometimes. Bodies tire. Attention wanders. Eyes close. The answer Rome eventually found, not overnight, but over generations, was the Roman legion in its mature form. A military machine of such systematic excellence that individual failure could be absorbed and corrected. Rotating watches. Strict protocols. Multiple layers of accountability. The goal was never to produce soldiers who didn't need sleep. The goal was to build a system where one person sleeping couldn't bring down everything. The sleeping guards of the Capitoline made a mistake. But they also inadvertently taught Rome something it would carry for centuries. The difference between hoping people won't fail and building something that survives when they do. And perhaps that is the most enduring lesson of that dark night on the hill above the burning city. Not a story of failure, not a story of heroism, but a story of how a civilization looked at its worst moment and decided, this will never happen to us again. And then went about building the most formidable military machine the ancient world had ever seen. The echoes of that night, the screaming geese, the scrape of Gallic hands on Roman stone, the sword dropped on the scales, the two terrible words, they would shape the next 500 years of Roman history. And in a way, through Rome's influence on law, military organization, political philosophy, and the very concept of civilizational resilience, those echoes reach all the way to us. Woe to the conquered, unless the conquered refuse to stay that way. Thank you for watching. If this story moved you, if you found yourself on that cliff in the darkness, listening for the geese, then this channel is for you. We tell the forgotten stories, the turning points, the moments where a single decision, a single lapse, a single alert flock of birds changed the trajectory of human civilization. Subscribe if you haven't already. Leave a comment below. I genuinely want to know, which part of this story surprised you most? Was it the sleeping guards? The geese? The sword on the scale? Or the dark fate of Manlius? Hit the notification bell so you don't miss what's coming next. Because we're not done with Rome. Not even close. And until next time, stay curious. Stay awake. And remember, history is never just the past. It's a warning.